going on?
You are under arrest for embezzlement of money.
Anything you say or do will be used against you in the court of law.
There is a moment, and if you have ever lived through one, you know exactly what it feels like when the ground beneath your life simply disappears. Not gradually, not with warning, all at once. 1 second you are standing on something solid, something you have trusted for years, something that felt as permanent and dependable as the earth itself. And then it is gone, and you are falling. And the most terrifying part is not the fall itself. The most terrifying part is the realization that the ground was never really there to begin with. That someone you loved had been slowly, quietly, methodically removing it from beneath your feet piece by piece, dollar by dollar, year after year while you slept beside them, cooked their dinner, washed their clothes, and called them your partner, your husband, your home. This is the story of Karen Whitfield. And when you hear everything, every detail, every deception, every moment of calculated cruelty, I need you to understand one thing before we begin. Karen Whitfield was not a careless woman. She was not a distracted woman. She was not, by any honest measure, a naive woman. She was a 52-year-old school librarian from Boise, Idaho, who had spent 24 years building a life she was proud of. A woman who read people well, who gave to her church, who remembered birthdays and kept promises and believed deeply, genuinely believed that the man she had married was the same man she thought she knew. That belief would cost her everything. $1 million, 2 decades of savings, her mother's inheritance, her retirement, her sense of safety, her sense of self. And on the morning of October 14, 2022, sitting alone at her kitchen table with a tablet in her hands and a cup of coffee going cold beside her, Karen Whitfield would discover that the man she had trusted most in this world had been stealing from her slowly, cleverly, and without a single moment of remorse for over 2 years. Before we go any further into this story, and I promise you, this story goes places you are not yet expecting, we want to hear from you. Let us know in the comments where you are watching from right now. Whether you are in Idaho or Indiana, in Texas or Tennessee, in a small town or a big city, we would love to hear from you. And if you are not already subscribed to this channel, please hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because the story you are about to hear is one of the most remarkable true accounts of financial betrayal, personal resilience, and hard-won justice that we have ever told. And it is just getting started. Now, before we go any further, before we follow Karen through the investigation, before we walk with her into that federal courtroom, before we find out exactly where Derek Whitfield was hiding and what he was planning when the agents knocked on his door, I want to lay out for you the 3 questions at the center of this story. 3 questions that every person who has ever heard this case asks, without exception, before the whole truth is revealed. Because this story, like all the most disturbing true stories, is not just about what happened. It is about how it happened and why. And what the person who thought he had gotten away with everything got so profoundly, catastrophically wrong about the woman he had chosen to betray. The first question is this: how does a man steal $1 million from a joint account, an account his wife had full legal access to, an account whose statements arrived in her email inbox every single month for 24 years without her knowing? How does that happen in a modern marriage, in the age of online banking and mobile alerts and instant transaction notifications? How does a man drain an account to $38,000 while his wife is living in the same house, sleeping in the same bed, sitting across from him at the same dinner table every night, and she does not know? That question has an answer. And the answer is one of the most unsettling things about this entire case, because it does not involve magic. It does not involve technical genius. It involves something far more ordinary and far more devastating. It involves trust. It involves the specific and terrible vulnerability of a woman who loved her husband and, in loving him, gradually allowed herself to stop examining the numbers he told her he was managing on her behalf. The second question is whether Derek Whitfield acted alone. Because the scale of this scheme, the Wyoming LLC, the Utah credit union account opened under an alias, the structured transfers designed to evade federal reporting thresholds, the cryptocurrency conversions, the real estate purchase held in a shell company name, all of that, taken together, represents a level of financial sophistication that made investigators ask, from the very beginning of their inquiry, whether Derek had help. Whether there was someone behind the architecture of this plan who understood the law well enough to know exactly which lines to approach and which to avoid. That question, too, has an answer. And it is an answer that would eventually produce a second arrest, a second indictment, and a second federal conviction, one that would reveal that the network of deception surrounding Karen Whitfield extended much further than even she had imagined on the morning she first opened that bank statement. And the third question, the one I want you to hold in the back of your mind for the entirety of the story, because it is the question that ties everything together, is this. What did Derek Whitfield get wrong about Karen? He planned this for years. He was careful. He was methodical. He was, by the assessment of experienced federal investigators, genuinely sophisticated in his approach. He had studied the systems and the loopholes. He had prepared an exit. He had a fake identity, a hidden property, a cryptocurrency portfolio, and a plane ticket to Mexico ready to go. He had thought of almost everything. So what did he miss? What was the single fatal miscalculation at the center of all that careful planning, the one crack in the foundation that brought the entire structure down on top of him? Stay with us, because that answer is the heart of this story, and it begins, of all places, with a binder. To fully understand the events of October 14th, 2022, and everything that followed, we have to go back. We have to go back to the beginning of Karen and Derek Whitfield's marriage, not to look for the obvious signs of a man planning to steal from his wife, because those signs were not obvious, not at the beginning, not for a very long time. We have to go back because the foundation of this story is not the crime itself. The foundation is the relationship, the dynamic, the slow, invisible process by which Derek Whitfield made himself the financial center of gravity in Karen's life, and made her, over years and years of small, incremental decisions, increasingly dependent on his version of their financial reality. Understanding how that happened is the only way to understand how the theft happened. And understanding how the theft happened is the only way to fully appreciate what Karen did next. Karen Eleanor Caldwell was born in 1970 in Twin Falls, Idaho, the third and youngest daughter of Harold and Ruth Caldwell. Harold drove long-haul trucks for a regional freight company, which meant he was home for 10 days and then gone for 2 weeks. Home again, then gone again, a rhythm that defined the texture of Karen's childhood in a house where her mother was, for practical purposes, the full-time head of household. Ruth Caldwell was not a woman given to sentiment about money. She had grown up poor in rural Oregon, the daughter of a family that lost everything in a bad harvest season the year she turned 7, and that early experience had given her a relationship with financial discipline that bordered on the devotional. She kept a written budget on a yellow legal pad taped to the inside of the kitchen cabinet door. She reconciled the checkbook every Friday night without fail. She taught all 3 of her daughters the same, and she told them more than once in the plain-spoken way that was Ruth Caldwell's particular gift, that a woman who does not know her own finances is a woman who has handed someone else the keys to her life. Karen absorbed those lessons thoroughly as a child. She was, by the accounts of her teachers and later her college professors, a meticulous student, organized, precise, thorough, the kind of person who kept her notes in color-coded folders and could tell you exactly where she had filed a receipt from 3 years ago. She studied library science at Boise State University, graduating in 1993, and spent the next 3 decades doing work she loved at Maple Ridge Elementary School, the kind of librarian who remembered which books every child had already read, who stayed late to help struggling readers, who organized summer reading programs out of her own pocket when the school budget ran short. She was, by every account from colleagues, parents, and students, a woman of extraordinary patience, warmth, and quiet competence. She was also, as the people who knew her would say repeatedly throughout the investigation, the last person on earth anyone would have expected to be a victim of something like this. Not because she was perfect, but because she was careful. She was the kind of woman who paid attention. She met Derek Whitfield at a church social in the fall of 1998. She was 28 years old. He was 31, freshly relocated from Portland, Oregon, where he had spent several years working at a mid-sized financial consulting firm. He was tall, well-dressed, confident without being arrogant, at least in those early days. He had a way of making people feel like the most important person in the room, a quality Karen would later describe to investigators as the thing that drew her to him most powerfully. He made her feel seen. He made her feel safe. He spoke about money with an ease and authority that Karen found reassuring rather than off-putting, especially given the financial anxiety she had grown up carrying. And when he offered early in their relationship to handle the financial side of their life together, Karen had not experienced it as a red flag. She had experienced it as a gift. That is the thing about financial control in a marriage. It rarely announces itself as control. It announces itself as partnership. It announces itself as love. They married in June of 1999 in a small ceremony at the church where they had met. Karen wore her mother's veil. Her sister Brenda was her maid of honor. The reception was held in the church fellowship hall, and Karen's mother Ruth cried through most of it, not from sadness, but from the particular relief of a woman who had worked herself to the bone and watched her youngest daughter choose what appeared to be a stable, responsible, loving man. Derek built a successful private consulting practice in Boise. He drove a late-model Lexus. He wore tailored suits to church on Sundays. He sat at the head of their table with an ease that suggested a man entirely comfortable in his own life. They had a daughter, Rachel Ann Whitfield, born in 1995 and raised in the kind of household that her teachers remembered as warm, stable, and quietly happy. And for many years perhaps, even for most of their marriage, Karen believed the picture was real. But financial investigators who later examined the records of Derek Whitfield's professional life would tell a very different story. A story that did not begin in 2020, as the bank records might initially suggest, but stretched back much further, at least to 2014, when Derek began making a series of increasingly reckless investment decisions that quietly eroded the foundations of his own financial world. Court documents filed during the federal proceedings would later reveal that Derek had been leveraging commercial real estate positions well beyond what his actual capital base could sustain. He had lost money on a series of private equity deals that evaporated almost entirely. He had borrowed from his own business operating accounts to cover personal losses, then borrowed from other sources to cover the business accounts, and had been caught in an accelerating cycle of debt concealment that by the end of 2018 had left him in a financial position he could not honestly disclose to anyone, least of all his wife. Karen's closest friend since their freshman year at Boise State, Stephanie Cole, would later describe the early years of the Whitfield marriage with a mixture of genuine warmth and retrospective unease. Stephanie had liked Derek well enough. In those early years he was good company, funny at dinner parties, generous with restaurant checks. But she had also, even then, unnoticed something she had struggled to name until the full truth of the situation became clear. Whenever the conversation at the table turned to money, to Karen and Derek's investments, their savings, their retirement plans, it was always Derek who answered, even when the question had been directed specifically at Karen. And Karen, rather than redirecting, would simply nod and let him speak. Stephanie had interpreted this, at the time, as the unremarkable feature of a marriage where one partner handled the finances. Looking back, she would say it looked more like a performance that had been running so long, neither of them seemed to notice it anymore. Karen's older sister, Brenda Larkin, 61 years old and a retired school teacher from Nampa, Idaho, had a blunter read on the situation. She had been skeptical of Derek Whitfield from approximately the third time she met him, not because she could point to anything specific, but because of a quality she described as a smoothness that never quite wore off the way it does with people who are genuinely comfortable in their own skin. She had raised her concerns with Karen more than once over the years, gently, then more directly as the marriage progressed, and had been met each time with the patient, affectionate dismissal that Karen reserved for people she loved, who she believed were worrying unnecessarily. Karen had never doubted Derek, not until the numbers on a tablet screen on a Friday morning in October told her she had no choice. And then there was Rachel, 27 years old in the fall of 2022, and a University of Idaho graduate working at a conservation nonprofit in Boise, living in a studio apartment 20 minutes from her parents' house. She had a warm relationship with both parents, or so she had believed. The discovery of her father's theft would force Rachel to reconstruct not just her understanding of her parents' marriage, but her entire memory of the childhood and adolescence she had lived inside it. The year 2014 is where the forensic trail truly begins. Not in the joint account, not yet, but in the private financial records of Derek Whitfield's consulting practice, where the first signs of serious instability were already quietly accumulating. Derek had by that point been running Whitfield Financial Consulting, LLC, for over a decade, and by the surface metrics the business appeared healthy. A stable client roster, a respectable downtown Boise office, a professional reputation that remained largely intact. But beneath that surface, Derek had been making investment commitments on behalf of his own personal portfolio, separate from his clients' accounts that were significantly beyond what his actual capital base could responsibly support. He had leveraged positions in commercial real estate in the Boise and Meridian markets. He had committed personal funds to 2 private equity ventures that both collapsed within 18 months. He had borrowed against his own business operating accounts to cover the personal shortfalls, then taken short-term loans to replenish the business accounts, creating a cycle of concealment that compounded with each passing quarter. By 2017, Derek Whitfield owed, by conservative estimate, somewhere between $300,000 and $400,000 more than he had disclosed to anyone, including his wife. The question investigators would later ask and never fully answer to their own satisfaction is precisely when Derek Whitfield decided that Karen's money was the solution to his problem. There is no email, no journal entry, no single documented moment of decision. What there is instead is a timeline, a sequence of preparations that, viewed in retrospect, make clear that by at least early 2019, Derek had begun moving pieces into place. In February of 2019, he filed the paperwork with Wyoming's Secretary of State to register Pinnacle Capital Resources, LLC. He did this through an online registered agent service, paying the annual fees from a personal credit card that Karen had no visibility into. In April of 2019, he opened the D. Allen Whitfield account at a credit union in Salt Lake City, Utah, driving there in person on a Tuesday, telling Karen he had a client meeting in Utah, checking into a hotel that night on a card that also did not appear on any statement Karen ever saw. He was building his infrastructure quietly, in the margins of an ordinary life, using the freedom that Karen's trust afforded him. It is worth pausing here to note something that financial abuse specialists and forensic accountants emphasize repeatedly when discussing cases of this kind. The infrastructure Derek built was not uniquely genius. What made it effective was not sophistication alone, it was access. Derek had access to Karen's trust, which meant he had access to time. He did not need to move fast. He did not need to take dramatic risks. He had years. And he had the patience of a man who was certain he would never be caught, because he was certain the woman he was stealing from would never look carefully enough to catch him. That certainty, which Derek apparently never seriously questioned throughout the entire 26 months of the theft, was the most consequential mistake he made, and it was a mistake rooted not in ignorance but in contempt. The transfers began in January 2020. The first was for $940. Logged in the joint account as a vendor services fee payable to Pinnacle Capital Resources, LLC. Karen saw this line item in the January statement. She did not flag it. Derek had been running his consulting business from their joint finances for years. Vendor fees, contractor payments, software licenses were routine line items on statements Karen reviewed each month. $940 was unremarkable. The second transfer came 3 weeks later, $2,060, then $1,400, then a gap of several weeks, then $3,000. The pattern was deliberate, irregular enough to avoid the appearance of a fixed recurring charge, small enough to stay well beneath the $10,000 federal reporting threshold, and framed within a vocabulary of business expenses that Karen had spent 20 years accepting without question. Derek had not just stolen Karen's money. He had stolen it using the language of a life she trusted. By the middle of 2020, as the rest of the country was locked down and financially disrupted by a global pandemic, Derek Whitfield was moving money out of the joint account at a rate that was quietly but unmistakably accelerating. The pandemic had, in a grim and ironic way, provided him additional cover. With Karen working from home and the usual rhythms of social and professional life suspended, The financial irregularities that might in ordinary times have prompted a question from a bank manager or a comment from an accountant were simply absorbed into the general atmosphere of economic uncertainty that everyone was living through. From January through December of 2020, Derek transferred approximately $280,000 from the joint account into Pinnacle Capital Resources, LLC, with $280,000 in 12 months, and Karen did not know. In 2021, the pace accelerated further and the mechanism changed. Using the spousal authorization form Karen had signed years earlier, a standard bank document she had signed without reading carefully. Trusting Derek's explanation that it was a routine update to their joint account profile, Derek had modified his transaction permissions to allow him to initiate and complete large wire transfers from the joint account without a separate in-person spousal sign-off. The form was legitimate. Karen had signed it. The bank had processed it appropriately. But what Karen had not understood when she signed it, what Derek had understood perfectly, was that it effectively removed the last practical barrier between him and the ability to wire whatever he wanted. Run whenever he wanted to wherever he wanted. Now there were transfers of $20,000, $40,000, $55,000, each one logged as a portfolio management transaction or a real estate investment fee, each one moving money from the life Karen had built into the infrastructure Derek had quietly constructed to replace it. The Teton Village condominium was purchased in March of 2021, a two-bedroom unit in Jackson, Wyoming, recorded in the name of Pinnacle Capital Resources, LLC. Derek paid the $65,000 down payment via wire transfer from the Pinnacle Capital account, which had itself been funded entirely by money from Karen's joint account. He visited the property 3 times over the following year, always on trips ostensibly related to client meetings in the Wyoming or Utah region. He brought Sandra Kerr twice. Sandra Kerr was 44, from Nampa, Idaho, and had come into Derek's life through a professional networking event in Boise in the spring of 2020, an event Derek told Karen was a client dinner. What Karen did not know, could not have known, was that by the following spring, she herself would invite Sandra Kerr into her own social circle at their church's annual women's retreat. Karen had sat beside Sandra during a morning session about gratitude and resilience. She had liked her immediately. She had invited her to lunch. She had described her to Brenda as exactly the kind of new friend she had been hoping to make. She had welcomed into the outer edges of her life the woman her husband was conducting an affair with, using Karen's own stolen money to do it. Was that specific fact of all the cruel facts in this story is the one that hit hardest. By October of 2022, the balance in the joint account had fallen to $38,912.47. Karen would later say, in a victim impact statement read aloud in a federal courtroom, that she remembered those 47 cents with a strange and specific vividness, the way you remember an absurd detail in the midst of catastrophe, as though her mind, unable to fully absorb the enormity of what had happened, had latched onto the smallest possible piece of it and held on. $38,912.47, where $1 million had been, where her mother's inheritance had been, where her retirement had been, where 24 years of a shared life had been. And on the morning of October 14, 2022, that was the number Karen Whitfield found when she sat down at her kitchen table with her tablet and her coffee and the quiet, persistent instinct that something was wrong. October 14, 2022 was a Friday. Derek left the house at 7:30, kissing Karen on the cheek and saying he had a client meeting in downtown Boise. He said they should go to dinner that weekend, that new Italian place she had been talking about. He said all of this with the same calm, unremarkable ease that had characterized 24 years of Friday mornings. And then he got in his Lexus and drove away from their home on Cottonwood Drive for the last time. Karen made a second cup of coffee. She fed the cat. She sat down at the kitchen table with her tablet to review the household finances, something she'd been doing with increasing frequency in recent weeks. After noticing that a home equity line of credit they had discussed using for a kitchen renovation seemed to have vanished from their online banking portal without explanation. She had asked Derek about it twice. He had given her 2 different answers. Some quiet and persistent instinct that she had perhaps been suppressing for months had told her to look more carefully. She looked. And in the time it takes to read a bank balance, 3 seconds, perhaps 4, the life Karen Whitfield had built over 52 years, began to collapse. She sat completely still for what she would later estimate was several minutes, staring at the number on the screen. She did not cry. Why, she did not scream. She called Derek's cell phone. It went straight to voicemail, not the usual 2 or 3 rings, but immediately, as though the phone had already been powered down. She called his office line. The receptionist told her Derek had not been in the office in 3 days. Karen put down her phone. She looked at the balance one more time, and then she picked up her keys and drove to the bank. The branch manager, a young man named Tyler, who had processed paperwork for the Whitfields on numerous occasions, saw Karen walk in and apparently understood within moments that something was seriously wrong. He pulled her into a private office, closed the door, and spent 45 minutes walking her through the full transaction history, every transfer, every amount, every date, every destination routing number. Karen sat with her hands folded in her lap and listened to all of it without interrupting. When Tyler finished, he asked if she was all right. Karen said she was fine. She thanked him. She shook his hand, and she walked out. She drove home. She walked into the bedroom. She opened Derek's closet. Every suit was gone. Every dress shirt, every tie, the good shoes, the leather weekend bag he had received as a gift on their 20th anniversary. All of it gone, cleared out with a thoroughness that told her this had not been a decision made in a moment of panic. This had been planned. This had been packed. This had been prepared for, quietly and carefully, while she slept beside him and trusted him and loved him and believed he was doing the same. On the kitchen counter, held down by the coffee mug Karen had left beside the sink that morning, this was a single sheet of notepaper. Derek's handwriting. She picked it up and read it. It said, "You never paid attention anyway. I deserve better than someone who never cared to look." Those were the only words he left her. 24 years, $1 million, her mother's inheritance, her retirement, her future, and 13 words scrawled on a piece of notepaper that told her exactly, precisely, devastatingly, what Derek had thought of her all along. That she was someone who would not look. That she was, in the final assessment of the man who had shared her bed and her table and her life for nearly a quarter of a century, gullible. He had written it down and walked out the door. And in doing so, he had made the most catastrophic mistake of his life. Karen Whitfield spent approximately 4 minutes standing in front of Derek's empty closet on the afternoon of October 14th, 2022. She would later be unable to say exactly how long it was time had done that thing it does in moments of profound shock, stretching and compressing simultaneously so that 4 minutes felt both like 4 seconds and 4 hours. What she knew, standing there looking at the bare wooden rods and the empty hangers and the ghostly outlines on the shelf where Derek's shoes had always been, was that she had 2 choices. She could fall apart, or she could begin. Karen Whitfield chose to begin. She picked up her phone and called her sister Brenda, first not to cry, but to say, "I need you here tonight. I need help thinking clearly. Hi, Ray, and I need you to bring your reading glasses because there is a lot of paper to go through." Then she called Stephanie Cole and said the same thing in slightly different words. And then, while she waited for them to arrive, she went to the home office, opened the filing cabinet, and began to pull every financial document she could find. What Karen assembled over the following 48 hours was, by any reasonable measure, a remarkable document. She printed every bank statement available through their online portal going back 2 full years. She printed every credit card statement. She pulled every wire transfer confirmation she could access. She organized them chronologically, tabbed them by account, highlighted every transaction to Pinnacle Capital Resources LLC in yellow, and every transaction she could not identify in red. Actually, she created a separate section for the home equity line of credit that had disappeared. She noted in her careful librarian's handwriting every date on which Derek had told her he was traveling for work over the preceding 2 years, cross-referenced against the dates of transfers she could now see had been made from their account while he was supposedly on the road. She put all of it in a 3-ring binder. She labeled the spine. And at 9:15 on the morning of October 16th, 2022, she walked into the Boise Police Department's Financial Crimes Division and placed that binder on the intake desk. Detective Marcus Hayes was 44 years old, a 20-year veteran of the Boise Police Department who had spent the last 8 of those years in the Financial Crimes Unit. developing a specialty in cases involving spousal financial fraud, investment scheme deceptions, and asset concealment. He was not a man given to emotional reactions at intake, but he would later tell colleagues that within the first 30 minutes of reading Karen Whitfield's binder, he had shifted from intake mode to investigative mode. Not because of the dollar amount, which was significant but not extraordinary for federal financial fraud cases. Because of the organization. Because of the Pinnacle Capital Resources LLC connection, Karen had already identified and Googled herself before walking through the door. Because of the cross-referenced travel dates. Because of the quiet, meticulous precision of a woman who, within 48 hours of discovering she had been robbed of everything, had begun building the case that would eventually put her husband in federal prison. Detective Hayes moved quickly, working in coordination with the Idaho Attorney General's Financial Crimes Division, and within days with the FBI's White-Collar Crime Unit. Hayes obtained a warrant for Derek Whitfield's full financial records within 72 hours of the initial complaint. What those records showed confirmed Karen's suspicions and, in several important respects, exceeded them. The Pinnacle Capital account had received $1,140,000 from the joint account over 26 months. Of that, approximately $420,000 had been moved into the D. Allen Whitfield account at the Salt Lake City Credit Union. For $300,000 had been converted to cryptocurrency across 3 exchange accounts. $65,000 had gone toward the Teton Village condominium down payment, and the remaining funds had been dispersed in a pattern that included hotel charges, restaurant bills, retail purchases, and repeated wire transfers to a personal account registered to Sandra Kerr of Nampa, Idaho. Detective Hayes noted the Nampa address. He added Sandra Kerr's name to the follow-up list. He did not yet know that Karen had met her at a church retreat. That detail would come later, and when it did, Hayes would say it was the moment the case stopped feeling like a financial crime file and started feeling like something that required a different kind of attention entirely. The first of the 3 major red herrings surfaced within 10 days of the initial filing. A former business associate of Derek's, a man named Craig Forsyth, contacted the Boise PD tip line to report that he had received a message from someone claiming to be Derek, who said he had fled to Costa Rica and was living in the coastal town of Tamarindo under the name David Warren. The tip was detailed enough to be credible. Detective Hayes was experienced enough to pursue the lead without abandoning his domestic investigation. The FBI's International Division made contact with Costa Rican authorities within days. The inquiry produced nothing. There was no David Warren fitting Derek's description anywhere along the Costa Rican coast that the authorities could locate. Hayes concluded the tip had been either fabricated by Forsyth for reasons of his own, or more disturbingly, planted by Derek himself through a burner phone as a deliberate attempt to redirect the investigation while he remained hidden somewhere in the continental United States. The second complication was more damaging. In late October 2022, Derek's younger brother Paul Whitfield contacted the Boise PD through his own attorney with a claim that threatened to complicate the entire case. Paul stated that Karen had been fully aware of the transfers to Pinnacle Capital Resources all along, that she and Derek had agreed to a quiet asset-shifting arrangement in anticipation of a divorce they had both been planning for over a year. Paul produced text messages between himself and Derek in which Derek made references to a mutual financial agreement with Karen. Karen's attorney, Diana Frost, a 50-year-old trial attorney from Boise, with a reputation for methodical and devastating cross-examination, retained a digital forensics expert within days. The expert's analysis revealed that all of the allegedly ongoing text conversations had been composed and sent from a single device within a window of approximately 4 hours, manufactured in a single sitting, to appear as though they had unfolded over months. The timestamps had been altered. The thread had been fabricated. Diana Frost presented this finding to federal prosecutors within 10 days. Paul Whitfield declined to press his claim further. The third complication was Sandra Kerr. So Sandra had retained an attorney within days of being contacted by investigators, and for a period of approximately 6 weeks, she declined to speak with the police or the FBI, claiming through her attorney that she had known nothing about Derek's marital status and had believed the money he spent on their relationship was legitimately his. Whether that claim was true or false, and the federal investigation ultimately chose to treat it as partially credible, granting Sandra limited immunity in exchange for her eventual cooperation, What it meant practically was that for 6 weeks, one of the most important witnesses in the case was inaccessible. And during those 6 weeks, the trail on Derek's cryptocurrency accounts was growing significantly harder to follow. Derek, wherever he was, appeared to be aware that it was costing them. And because during those same 6 weeks, Karen received a text message from an unknown number. It said only, "Stop looking. You already got the house. Be smart." Karen photographed the message. She sent it to Detective Hayes. She did not stop looking. The case broke open on December 3rd, 2022, not from a law enforcement breakthrough, not from a digital forensics win. It broke open because Karen Whitfield went through a cardboard box. She had been clearing out the home office, a task she had undertaken partly to stay occupied during the long weeks of waiting, and partly because she needed the psychological act of reclaiming the physical space Derek had occupied in their home. In a cardboard box pushed to the back of the closet, beneath a stack of old client files and a broken desk lamp, Karen found a manila folder. On inside the folder were approximately 30 pages of printed emails, spanning from early 2019 through mid-2021. The emails were between Derek and a man identified only by the initials RM. The content, read in sequence, was an operational guide to the entire scheme. The Wyoming LLC formation, the Salt Lake City alias account, the structuring strategy for the transfers, and specific discussion of how to move amounts below the federal threshold in patterns timed to avoid the bank's compliance software. Derek had printed these emails at some point and stored them in his home office, and in his hurry to disappear, he had left them behind. Karen photographed every page and called Detective Hayes at 7:15 in the morning. Hayes was at her door by 8:30. Within hours, a forensic accountant had identified RM as Raymond Mercer, a 61-year-old disbarred financial attorney from Salt Lake City with 2 prior federal fraud convictions, whose professional license had been permanently revoked in 2011. Mercer had reinvented himself as an off-the-books consultant for individuals who needed the kind of expertise that no licensed professional could ethically provide. He had designed the architecture of Derek's theft, guided the execution of the transfers, and advised on the cryptocurrency conversion strategy. Raymond Mercer was arrested at his Salt Lake City home on December 8, 2022. The discovery of those emails transformed a single defendant fraud case into a federal criminal conspiracy, and it was Karen who had found them. Detective Hayes, speaking to colleagues after Mercer's arrest, said it plainly. Karen Whitfield, a school librarian from Boise, had done more to break this case than anyone else involved in the investigation. She had simply gone through a box. On January 9th, 2023, 87 days after Karen walked into the Boise Police Department with her 3-ring binder, federal agents from the FBI's Phoenix field office arrested Derek Allen Whitfield at a rented apartment in the Arcadia neighborhood of Phoenix, Arizona. He was found at 6:45 in the morning, still in his bathrobe, in the process of making coffee. He did not run. He did not resist. He looked at the agents at his door, and then he looked past them, as though searching the hallway behind them for something he had perhaps always known, at some level, would eventually be there. He was handcuffed and walked to a waiting vehicle without incident. Neighbors who saw it happen described a man who looked not so much shocked as deflated, like a structure from which all the air had been slowly let out. In a fireproof safe found in Derek's bedroom closet, agents recovered a burner laptop, 3 prepaid debit cards with a combined balance of approximately $22,000, $14,000 in cash, bundled in rubber-banded stacks, 2 forms of identification bearing the name Daniel Allen Warren constructed from his own middle name and his maternal grandmother's maiden name, and a one-way plane ticket to Cancun, Mexico, departing January 28, 2023. He had been in Phoenix for approximately 10 weeks. He had been planning to run again. He had simply, for the first time in the entire arc of this story, run out of time. And the agents also recovered on the burner laptop evidence of ongoing attempts to liquidate the remaining cryptocurrency holdings, a process that had been partially completed, moving approximately $140,000 in digital assets into a wallet address that the FBI's cryptocurrency forensics team would spend the following weeks tracing through a chain of intermediary wallets. When the federal agents informed Derek, during his initial processing, that Karen had found the printed emails in the cardboard box, the folder he had left behind, in the home office closet in his hurried departure, Derek did not speak for a long moment. Then, according to the agents present, he said quietly, "She actually found those." The tone they would note in their reports was not angry. It was not panicked. Far and it was something closer to genuine disbelief. As though, even in that moment, even having been arrested in his bathrobe in a Phoenix apartment with a fake ID and a one-way ticket to Mexico in his bedside safe, Derek Whitfield had not fully reconciled himself with the possibility that Karen Whitfield was the kind of person who would find what needed to be found. He had built an entire scheme on the premise that she would not, and she had. Sandra Kerr, having been granted limited immunity by the federal prosecution in exchange for her cooperation, made a phone call to Karen in the week following Derek's arrest. It was the first time the two women had spoken since the previous summer. The phone call lasted 45 minutes. Karen sat at her kitchen table, the same table where she had discovered the theft, the same table where she had assembled her binder, the same table that had been the staging ground for everything that followed, and she listened to what Sandra Kerr had to tell her. Sandra told Karen that Derek, in the weeks before his disappearance, had been preparing something beyond the fake identity and the cryptocurrency liquidation and the one-way ticket to Cancun. He had been building a fabricated documentary record, falsified account statements, doctored correspondence, manufactured financial disclosures that he intended to submit to the Internal Revenue Service as a whistleblower complaint against Karen, accusing her of tax fraud and the deliberate concealment of income from her late mother's estate. The plan was designed as a preemptive strike. If Karen came forward about the missing money, Derek would already have poisoned the well by positioning her as a financially dishonest person under federal investigation for tax crimes. He had apparently been working on this plan for over a year. He had not completed it before he ran, whether because he ran earlier than planned or because he had not finished assembling the fabricated evidence, Sandra could not say with certainty. But the intent had been real. He had talked about it to Sandra in enough detail that she had no doubt he had meant to use it. Karen listened to all of this in silence. When Sandra finished, Karen thanked her for calling. She hung up the phone. She sat at the kitchen table for a long time, in the same chair, in the same house, beneath the same ceiling that had been the sky of her married life for over 2 decades. And she thought about what it meant that the man who had called her gullible in a note had simultaneously been preparing a year-long plan to destroy her reputation, because some part of him, beneath all that contempt, had understood she might fight back after all. The federal indictment against Derek Allen Whitfield, filed in the United States District Court for the District of Idaho on February 17, 2023, contained 8 counts: wire fraud, bank fraud, money structuring, interstate transportation of fraudulently obtained property, identity fraud, conspiracy to commit wire fraud naming Raymond Mercer as co-conspirator, fraudulent use of a spousal financial authorization instrument, an obstruction of justice for the fabricated Costa Rica tip, and the manufactured text thread Paul Whitfield had been induced to present. 8 counts. 8 a federal indictment. And at the center of it, as the primary complaining witness, as the person whose meticulous documentation and quiet, relentless persistence had made the prosecution possible, Karen Whitfield, school librarian, wife, the woman Derek had called gullible on a piece of notepaper left on a kitchen counter, the woman who had gone through every box. The trial of Derek Allen Whitfield in the United States District Court for the District of Idaho began on September 8, 2023, and ran for 11 days. The prosecution, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Carolyn Mills, presented 412 exhibits, including the Shell Company registration documents, the complete forensic reconstruction of the transfer history, the Raymond Mercer email correspondence, the D. Allen Whitfield Credit Union account records, the burner laptop recovered from the Phoenix apartment, and the Teton Village condominium deed showing Pinnacle Capital Resources, LLC, as the registered owner. The jury also heard testimony from Detective Marcus Hayes, from the forensic accountant who had reconstructed the full transfer timeline, from the FBI agent who led the Phoenix arrest, and from Karen Whitfield herself, who took the stand on the 4th day and spent 3 hours describing, in precise and unflinching detail, Everything she had discovered, everything she had built, and everything she had lost. Karen did not cry on the stand. She had decided before she took the oath that she would not. Not because she did not feel the grief she felt it every day. Ash would feel it for years, but because she had spent the preceding 11 months refusing to let Derek Whitfield's assessment of her be the final word. He had called her someone who never paid attention. She had paid attention to every single thing that mattered in this case, and she was going to pay attention now. She was going to be precise and clear and completely in command of herself, in the same room where the man who had called her gullible was sitting 12 feet away, because that was the most powerful thing she could do. Her attorney, Diana Frost, had told her before the trial, "The jury does not need you to be broken. They need to see who you are." And Karen Whitfield showed them who she was. For 3 hours, she was precise and clear and completely unbroken. Derek did not look at her during her testimony. She looked at him. She did not look away. The defense attempted across 11 days to construct a narrative in which Karen's own financial passivity bore meaningful responsibility for the situation, arguing that a more engaged co-account holder would have identified the irregularities earlier, and that Derek had never truly believed his actions constituted fraud because he had always intended to repay the funds from anticipated investment returns. This argument was undermined by the Raymond Mercer emails, which contained detailed discussion of how to avoid fraud detection, a discussion that is not consistent with someone who believes their transfers are legitimate. It was further undermined by the fake identity, the plane ticket, the fabricated Costa Rica tip, and the manufactured text thread. And it was definitively buried by Diana Frost's closing argument, in which she asked the jury to hold in their minds simultaneously two facts: that Derek Whitfield had left a note on his wife's kitchen counter calling her gullible, and that the case the prosecution had just spent 11 days presenting had been made possible almost entirely by that same wife. Those two facts, Frost told the jury, are not in tension with each other. They are the same story. He underestimated her, and she proved him wrong. On September 22, 2023, after 6 hours and 14 minutes of deliberation, the jury returned a unanimous verdict on all 8 counts. Guilty. Derek Allen Whitfield was found guilty of wire fraud, bank fraud, money structuring, interstate transportation of fraudulently obtained property, identity fraud, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, fraudulent use of a spousal, financial authorization instrument, and obstruction of justice. He was remanded to custody immediately. At his sentencing hearing 6 weeks later, he was given 9 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution of $1,140,000, the full amount forensically documented as having been transferred from the joint account. Raymond Mercer, sentenced separately, received 6 years in federal prison and was ordered to pay joint and several restitution. The Teton Village condominium purchased with Karen's money, registered in the shell company Derek had built to hide her money, was ordered seized and its proceeds applied to the restitution total. Karen was not in the courtroom for the sentencing. She had been present for every day of the trial, and she had been present for the verdict, and she had read her 12-page victim impact statement aloud in a voice the courtroom reporter later described as the most controlled she had heard in 30 years of courtroom work. But for the sentencing itself, Karen chose not to attend. She had said everything she had to say. She had done everything she had to do. She spent the morning of the sentencing driving through the Boise foothills with her sister Brenda, stopping at a diner they had been going to since they were teenagers, ordering the same thing they had always ordered eggs over easy, wheat toast, black coffee, and talking about things that had nothing to do with Derek Whitfield. It was, Brenda would later say, the first morning in over a year that they had managed that. Here's the final thing I want to tell you about this story. It is something Karen said at a women's financial literacy event in Boise in March of 2024, 5 months after the sentencing, to a room of approximately 200 women. She was not speaking as a victim. She was not speaking as a survivor, which is a word she had complicated feelings about. She was speaking as a librarian, as someone who had spent her entire professional life understanding that the most important thing you can give another person is the right information at the right moment. She said this: "The note Derek left on my counter told me what he believed about me. And I want every woman in this room to understand something about that belief. It was not a belief he arrived at quickly. It was a belief he cultivated over 24 years by gradually and systematically removing me from the financial decisions of my own life, all until the distance between me and my own money was wide enough for him to walk through. Financial control in a marriage does not begin with theft. It begins with 1,000 small moments in which one person says, "I will handle that," and the other person says, "Thank you." It begins with trust. And the only antidote to it is what my mother tried to teach me, and what I should have held on to more tightly. Know your own numbers. Know your own accounts. Know your own financial life as well as you know anything else about yourself. Because that knowledge is not just financial security, it is freedom. And no one should ever be able to take it from you while you sleep beside them and call them your home. As of early 2024, Karen Whitfield has recovered approximately $640,000 of the stolen funds through asset seizure and restitution payments received to date. She has sold the house on Cottonwood Drive and relocated to a smaller home in southern Idaho, where she has lived quietly and by the accounts of every person in her life, with a sense of peace that feels hard-won and entirely deserved. She volunteers at the local library. She has lunch with Stephanie Cole every other Friday. She speaks once a week by phone with her daughter Rachel, who has relocated to Portland and is doing well. She has not spoken to Derek since the morning he drove away. She does not intend to. Detective Marcus Hayes was promoted to lieutenant in the Financial Crimes Division in the spring of 2023. Diana Frost went on to represent 2 other spousal financial fraud victims in the 18 months following the verdict, winning both cases. Raymond Mercer is serving his sentence at a federal facility in Utah. Derek Whitfield is serving his sentence at a federal correctional institution in Florence, Arizona, the same state he fled to, believing it would be far enough from the woman he had decided was too gullible to follow him. There is a question I want to leave you with tonight. Not about Derek. I think we have covered everything worth saying about Derek Whitfield. The question I want to leave you with is about Karen, specifically about the moment. Because there is always a moment in these stories, a single moment, where everything that comes after becomes possible. And in Karen's story, I keep coming back to the same one. Not the morning she found the bank balance. Not the night she assembled the binder. The moment I keep returning to is the one nobody witnessed. It is the moment Karen stood in front of Derek's empty closet, with the note on the kitchen counter and the knowledge of what the bank statements meant fresh and raw and devastating in her chest, and she made a choice. She could have fallen apart. Almost anyone would have. She had every right to fall apart, but she didn't. She called Brenda. She called Stephanie, and she began. I want you to think about that choice, because I believe that choice, that specific, quiet, unwitnessed choice, is the real heart of this story. Everything else followed from it. So here is what I am asking you to do tonight. First, tell me in the comments what you think was the moment Derek made his fatal mistake. Was it the note he left on the counter? Was it the folder he forgot in the cardboard box? Was it the day he handed Karen that account authorization form, trusting she would sign it without reading it? Was it even further back than that, the day he decided, somewhere deep in his own certainty, that the woman beside him was someone who could be fooled? I want to hear from you. And second, if this story moved you, if it made you think about the women in your own life who trust completely and keep the details quietly and show up every time they are needed, please share this video with them. Because sometimes the most valuable thing we can do for the people we love is help them see the patterns a little sooner than Karen was able to. And if you are not already part of this community, please subscribe right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Thank you for watching. Thank you for staying with Karen's story all the way to the end. She would want you to know your numbers.